Hi everybody that I know, but also hi everybody that I don't know and are just as interested in these fantastic animals that connect us around the world. So for this talk, I have the real pleasure to be joined by three co-authors, which I would say are some of the seniors in our endeavors. Chris Hassell, our fieldman in Northwest Australia, and his efforts ensure that we can actually make observations on the birds, and some of which that I will show in due course. And then Professor Guangchun from Beijing Forestry University, who has a very long-term vision, which I totally share. So I'm very pleased that we can work together and hope that that we will establish long-term observation network that I will be talking about later today. And then there's David Melville, an old hand in the flyway, I would say, that I've known for a very, very long time. And Rich might have been a little bit inspired by me when he was younger. I have been very much inspired by David when I was younger, and it's fantastic that we can still work together and carry some flag together and even spend time in the field just as 2 years ago in China. Fantastic. Anyway, right now we are bound to our desks, so we're desk workers because a virus prevents us from going, so that this prevents us from infecting each other. So I hope that this meeting will do a lot of infections of another kind, of sharing good ideas. So this is enough for an introduction, I think. So let's go to the meat of the story. So we live in interesting times. Lots of things are happening. The hand of the people on the global situation is increasing and increasing. And this shows also in what happens to the birds and the habitats we care about. So this is the realm of nature conservation, you would say. You could also say it's the realm of the whole human society. And what I've noticed for a long time is that nature conservation is reactive rather than proactive. So something is happening, and then they run to the fore. So to explain that, so a reactive form of nature conservation is kind of a fire brigade model. You identify a problem, an almost extinct species of shorebird, for example, and then you roar in and do something about it. And this is okay, it's great, and it prevents even worse things. But wouldn't it be also good to think about being more proactive, kind of a fire alarm model, seeing things in advance, engaging with species of shorebirds and other species before they become vulnerable and threatened. So that's kind of the model I very much believe in, because then we still have the birds to work with. And also the only way to prove a process hindering the birds is by being there when it happens. So that was kind of my personal motivation to start something, to do critical observations, and also the outreach, telling about it, and what I regard as very critical times. This was the personal motivation of starting Global Flyway Network as as small as possible organization on the shorebird ecological demographics and conservation, but as far-reaching as possible. So this is not about the organization, it's about the work we do. And the other guy that was sharing the dream was Alan Baker, born in New Zealand, grown up in New Zealand, did his PhD in New Zealand on oyster catchers, and then became a professor in Canada. And at that time I got to know him, and we shared many passions, red knots being one of them, Latin America being another. And together we established the Global Flyway Network in 2006, which was actually a floating idea to put Phil Badley on the ground in New Zealand. But he achieved that himself, so that wasn't necessary. But in 2006, BirdLife Netherlands reached out and said, okay, can we help you in doing important things. So that's what we start doing. So what does Global Flyway Network, this really small organization, tries to do? Of course, we try to do the best possible science. Why? Because the best possible science should give the most robust and undiscussed values that we can have. Well, the next task is to be a sentinel. As I said, we want to be the fire alarm system. So by looking at populations, we can be there early on and indicate what's happening to these populations before they get really, really threatened. And in order to bring this to the people, we need to develop stories based on the science. And so we also try to engage with people that are much better in telling the stories than ourselves. And the people, the musicians, the filmmakers, the theater makers are the ones that can do that. And I know there is a couple in the audience too. Let's start off with the sentinel. So what kind of sentinel system did we have in mind? Well, this is what we had in mind 15 years ago. A couple of species that occur around the world, a species group, the knots, the godwits, and maybe rough and sanderling as well as the selected species. And of course, this was inspired by the work that was already on the go, the work that we entertained here in the Netherlands with field work in West Africa, and also entertained in Latin America. And we thought we should develop that or encourage that in the East Asian-Australasian flyway as well. Things were on the go there as well, of course. Now this slide is clearly undated. This is an inaugural slide, 15 years, so it's totally out of date. And the reason it's out of date, I hope to show you later. Now this was a table that we started with, a list of all the subspecies and kind of the ecological characteristics and whether they were doing well or not so well. And you can see most of the populations at the time were already in decline. And I must say, not much has changed. So you could say this is the reactive part of the whole story, except that most of the subspecies are still quite common. Now, one question that might be coming up in the listeners, and so I'll deal with that now, is why would Europe, and indeed other parts of the world like Canada, Ellen Baker, be interested in the Asia Pacific in the first place? Why don't you stay at home and don't worry about the rest of the world? Well, actually in the meetings this morning, I came across two nice examples why the rest of the world would be interested in Asia Pacific, and also why Asia Pacific should be interested in Europe or America. One is this slide shown by Jesse. So this is a screen grab that I did, and this makes the point that we can learn deeply from comparisons. What happens? So we can learn from that in evolutionary terms, as Jesse was doing this morning. But we can also learn this afternoon, I should say. We can also learn deeply in ecological ways. We can learn what happens to Islandica knots to say more about what happens to the Roselari knots or the Rogersii knots, for example. Another example why Europe should be interested is based on this slide that I stole from Mr. Lee from Singapore. And this was a very exciting slide for me. And the reason it's very exciting is that the Singaporean wintering birds are going to parts of the world that we consider as part of our flyway. Notably, this part of the world, Yamal, and the Taimyr Peninsula. And for example, there is a whimbrel here and a grey plover that go to the places that our birds are also going to. So there is so much overlap in the breeding ranges of the birds that we are studying together. So we really live in one world. as COVID-19 also points out. Well, the next thing that I want to discuss is our research philosophy. And you could say that our research philosophy is built on change. Change, I hope I pronounce this strongly. Because the chain is only as strong as its weakest links. So that gives us a kind of a search image in our research. Because we are dealing in a world of change, so spatially shorebirds migrate along chains of suitable habitats. So that's one chain. Temporally, demographic rates multiply along change of events over time. So we need to study them in space, and we need to study them over time. And thirdly, chain observations have to be made. So that's the method. Chain observation along the flyway. So we have to have repeated observations between years, and if we want to be more detailed, between seasons, and also across sites. So this is big. So we need cooperation. We need lots of people on board to do this properly. So that's the philosophy, and now the practice of our work. So it builds basically on two things: on demographic bookkeeping, and it builds on the study of migration and habitat use. Now the demographic bookkeeping mainly takes place on the basis of individual column arcs. And most of the listeners and watchers are familiar with that. You individualize a shorebird with its rather long legs by a combination of colorings and flags, either with symbols on it or not. A particularly strong new method to study migration habitat use, in addition to the individual column marking, is the use of solar-powered satellites. And we have seen several examples this morning of people using those particular methods. Right, let's go on a little bit more in depth with the demographic bookkeeping exercise. And this is the way I explain it to lay people, why our birds are so incredibly suited for this kind of approach. So this is a Portuguese wall with a depiction of stilt walkers, stilt people walking on stilts. And that's exactly the Dutch name for shorebirds, for waders, stilt walkers, steltlopers. And if you have long legs, of course, they are ideally suited to put colorings on. And then they live in open landscape. You go in the field and you can watch these rings. So this realization is the basis of the start of individual color marking, demographic bookkeeping in parts of the world that I've been involved with firstly, and we started this work in the 90s in the Dutch Waddenzee with red knot, with sanderling, with bar-tailed godwit, and also here in the breeding grounds with black-tailed godwits, and extended this work with programs in West Africa, very much connected, sometimes different subspecies, with red knot, sanderling, and bar-tailed godwit. And then through the resources from BirdLife Netherlands, we could start in 2006 in Northwest Australia, the receiving grounds of much of this flyway that we talk about with red knots, great knots, bar-tailed godwits, and black-tailed godwits. And of course, this is supplemented with other efforts in other parts of the world that I won't individually name now. Some results. So individual color marks. And here are some red knots with individual color marks from Northwest Australia, because that's exactly where we started. And some of you may recognize the road along the northern beaches, Roebuck Bay, near Broome. And there's the puddle. This is the end of this is actually the wet season. Puddle in the road, and of course you immediately recognize the outlines of Australia, even the island of Tasmania, and the red dot shows us where we are at this point. From 2006, in cooperation with the Australasian Wader Studies Group, Chris Hassell, on behalf of Global Flyway Network, has carried out a color ringing program at Roebuck Bay, and that's continued till today. And very much, this is a community effort. on the catching days, people from Broome get out and help Chris and his closest co-workers to catch the birds, treat them carefully, and release them with individual collar marks. So this has been going on for a long time. And then Chris himself and a couple of close co-workers are making year-round observation of the collar-banded birds in Roebuck Bay, but also at 80 Mile Beach. And some of the lay of the land is such that it's cut out for this kind of observations. And here you see Chris observing a high tide roost. So we are doing this work with 4 species, but I'll dwell now on an analysis that a lot of you know, but some of you won't, on red knots, great knots, and bar-tailed godwits, which are the birds that rely on the yellow sea during migration, staging for the onward flights to the high Arctic breeding grounds. And this is the summary of a lot of work done in Northwest Australia, but also in China, on what happened to the apparent survival, seasonal survival in this case, of these 3 species. And the novelty of this analysis was that we analyzed the demography of the 3 species in one modeling effort due to the impressive efforts by Tama Locke, who was carrying this out for us. So it's a single analysis on 3 species, multiple seasons, 3 seasons that in this particular analysis, and over 7 years. And what you basically can see is that over time, nothing much changes with the seasonal survival during the early non-breeding season and the late non-breeding season, but the survival was in steep decline in all 3 species without difference between them during the migration season in Asia. And given that these birds breed in very different areas with different climatic regimes, our conclusion was that the yellow sea is the weakest link in the chain. And of course, this has been documented in other studies from Rich's group in Brisbane as well, the STUD study and so on. So this was an indication that what was going on at the yellow sea was negatively affecting this group of shorebirds. But it's still an inference, it's still a pattern. So can we come closer to that story? Do we know enough about these birds, you could also ask. And this is where solar power satellite tags come into the story. So we have been using solar power satellite tags, especially PTTs, in several places, many places now in the world, to study migration of individuals and habitat use. And this is all based on measurements of the Doppler effect, which is explained in this particular paper in Movement Ecology. I won't dwell on the details. It is also very nicely explained in a paper on cranes by Higuchi and Pierre in Landscape Ecology and Engineering. And the long and the short is that our data are stored at MoveBank, are then transferred to our own system. And to explain that a little bit more, I'll go through this example once more. So we have a transmitter on the back of a bird, this particular case a crane, sends signals to the satellites, then these signals are processed and the locations are computed by the Argos Global Processing Center in France. They are then sent to MoveBank, where we get them a couple of hours later, and eventually they go to, in the case of our own birds, to globalflywaynetwork.org, designed by Bastien Blau, to have almost real-time indicators of where birds are. And actually what we work very hard on is to be able to share this with everybody in the world that has access to internet and can access the website. And this shows you the example of what has happened this year between April and October with the tracking of bar-tailed godwits and whimbrel in West Africa, in this case, or the whimbrel, in Oman, in Northwest Australia, and in New Zealand, show you the tracks of the birds, what birds have been doing this particular year. The birds in Oman on the Saudi Peninsula are birds that were tagged 5 years ago. So there's only one survivor right now. And this also is true for the birds from Northwest Australia. This is an old study. That's still one bird showing us what's going on. And you can see a pretty picture of how the world is connected, with lots of our West African birds going to the Taimyr Peninsula, where birds from Singapore are also going. So this combines everything: science, sentinel, and stories that we try to develop. There's lots of outputs from this kind of work, and we had to make a choice in this presentation, and the choice went to the work by Yingqi Chen, a PhD student with us here on Hassell in the Netherlands. Jin is from Hong Kong originally, and she has studied the migration of great knots and bata godwits from Northwest Australia. And Jeannie actually took the trouble of reaching out and trying to make these tracks available to a larger audience. In order to do that, you have to go to this particular website. And I'll use that visualization to show you what we learned during the tracking of the great knots. So this is the map that Jeannie made of all the sites used by great knots coming from Northwest Australia and going to the breeding ground. So these are the staging and stopover sites during migration, not the breeding sites and not the non-wintering destination. And you have three colors there that I'll go and explain now in a minute, because now comes the relevance to nature conservation. So these were the observations, the size of the dot indicating the number of observations of sites known by the conservation community as important sites for great knots. And there were also sites that weren't known as important sites for great knots, but were known as sites that were important for migratory shorebirds at the time we did the study. And these are the blue sites. So you can see many sites on coastal China that were actually identified as shorebird sites, but not so much as great knot sites. So that was new information. But then there's lots of sites that were not known at all in your part of the flyway. At least they might be known to local people. They might be known to lots of people in the audience, but they were not on paper as registered as official sites. In the Philippines, in Indonesia, but also lots of sites around the Yellow Sea, also southern China, and also in Russia. Now, the nice thing about this website, you can see the link here, is that there's also information. If you click on all these sites, on what these sites are called and whether it's an unknown site or something. And this, of course, in the future could be elaborated. We also published this properly as a research article in the Journal of Applied Ecology. And the gist of the story is that with this kind of unbiased observational effort by satellite tracking from North Australia, we discover unknown sites, lots of them actually. In Russia, about half of the sites that great knots used were not on our mental net. In the Yellow Sea, in the Koreas and China, about 40% of the sites, surprisingly, were not on the conservation mental net. In southern China, it was about 60%. In Southeast Asia, to our big surprise, none of the sites were on the mental maps that we have construed. So it shows that we know rather little, and our conclusion was that satellite tags give spatially and temporally unbiased data on distribution and of occurrence, and even today we can make lots and lots of discoveries. And this is, of course, the impetus for lots of the tracking that goes on in your flyway, and very successfully. Well, there's another element in addition to demography and tracking. And that element is what steers these birds to particular places. Now, during migration, the most important thing for shorebirds on the one hand is safety. We heard about hunting this morning, this afternoon I should say, and we heard about also a little bit about food. And the point I want to make here is that food, of course, is an incredibly important driver and something that needs to be studied as well. This is very much muddy, on-the-ground work. And this is a picture of Nanpu, northern Bohai Bay in the western Yellow Sea, where red knots forage, and one of the local fishermen is foraging too. And during our studies, carried out together with the team from Beijing Normal University, we found that this particular species on the China coast is very, very, very important. This is a Potembo corbula, a small bivalve that is very easy to crush. And this is a staple food of red knots, but also great knots and some other species. And what we have tried to do in conjunction with the satellite tracking is mapping out the bentos in all these known but also newly found sites. So even though we can be on the desk and look at the data coming in and looking at our website, we still need to do the stuff on the mud research on the what you could call the boundary conditions. Safety is one. This relates to hunting and other pressures, but food is an incredibly important one too. And Gubo Peng has been carrying out this program now under the supervision of Beijing Forestry University, built on the efforts that he could do from Fudan University and the team at Fudan of mapping bentos along the China coast. And he does that year after year. Of course, we are still struggling with the analysis. It is an immense effort in the field, nice team efforts, training lots and lots of people, but also it's very demanding in the laboratory. So this is still things that we need to solve, but it's yielding very important information. Just as a tiny glimpse of what we are finding is the summary of Gubo, of what we are finding along the Chinese coast. Well, we're finding two things. First of all, that in most of the places, commercial species actually dominate the intertidal mollusk communities. So these are species that are harvested, of course, but also very often seeded, sometimes protected against predators, things that people use as their own food and use in commercial ways. And we think that this now explains the fact that if you look along the enormous coast of China, we don't find a latitudinal biodiversity gradient anymore. So if you go to the south of China, the north of China, you find the basic species composition, which is dominated by the commercial species. So that's an important conclusion. And I should point out that this is not necessarily a bad thing for the birds. So we'll hear from Gubo Peng in the fullness of time, who is analyzing the pros and cons of these systems. So I would say watch this space for his work. Okay, so I've given a review introducing demography, introducing tracking, introducing the food studies. And then the question is, of course, because I started off rather ambitiously, so have we been able to be proactive rather than reactive? Have we been able to implement the fire alarm system? And I would say the answer is well, a little bit. What we have been doing in terms of proactivity to some extent, I will explain now. And this is based on the tracking in the last couple of years of the battle godwits from Northwest Australia. This is the work again of Ginny Chen. And on the basis of birds marked in Roebuck Bay and at 80 Mile Beach, through the efforts of Chris Hassell, we have been able to describe habitat use, along the flyway. But what we now focus in is the habitat use along the southern Jiangsu coast. And as I already explained, we can do this in spatially totally unbiased ways. So you have the tracks here during northward migration on the left, during southward migration on the right, and let's focus on this red block in the center. Before we go back to what the tag birds show us, we have to know a little bit about this site along the southern Jiangsu coast. A lot of people know this as a very important site. This is an overview of the intertidal bentos and the reclamation that have happened, plus the reclamations that are planned. And I take this all from a new paper that we wrote with the civil engineers from Delft University and Hohai University, using satellite tracking as a means to do smart engineering of harbor designs. So this is the overview of the intertidal with the reclamations and so on. And this led Jos Mulder to do a classification of the intertidal habitats. And you see that on the map here. And the next thing we did is realize what the full pore designs were showing, and connecting this with the habitat used by satellite Bartel Godwits and actually also great knots. But for ease of presentation, I will show you here the distribution based on the location of the satellite birds of the Bartel Godwits in this particular area, indicated by the degree of redness in this particular case. So now we can make a link between our habitat classification, the distribution of birds, and look at their selectivity, what kind of intertidal habitats these birds use. So knowing this, we can then, and well, this means the civil engineers in Delft and at Hohai can make predictions on what different habitat designs would lead to in terms of the different intertidal habitats. And this is a series of prognostic exercises, what will happen over the next 20 years when you don't build any more harbors and when you build harbors of different designs, and what this would lead to. And the nice thing is that that you can then actually come to almost, I should say, win-win scenarios. So by reviewing different land claim, so engineering scenarios, we actually found options that would increase rather than decrease the habitat types used by Bartel Godwits and actually also great knots, by harbor designs that in smart ways capture the sediments rather than losing them. So I would say this is kind of a proactive way of going about things, which actually leads me almost to the end of the story. So clearly the take-home message is here that we very much believe in the descriptive monitoring type of observations on demography, individual migrations, and food resource dynamics. And it's the aim of this consortium to maintain and develop this portfolio in the Asia Pacific. And we think this is an incredibly important time to do that because there are so many changes underway. There's positive changes, conservation being successful in some parts, leading to not carrying out land claim programs, leading to the stopping of hunting, leading to the recreation of important habitats. But of course, there's also many negative things because there's still more humans. They do lots of things to the world. They need their space also. And then we have the increasing issue of climate change, which is especially strong at the high Arctic, which I didn't dwell upon. I could have, but there's only so much time. So there's lots of changes in positive and negative ways. And we strongly believe that these birds can tell us important stories of how the world is changing. And also these birds can help us verifying whether what we do in a positive way is actually a success, hoping that for the first time, these successes can boost the good things. I think that would be my most important hope, that showing that things work in conservation would boost the conservation efforts. I think that's where especially the tracking could be incredibly important. Now, all this work takes a lot of money, and I have a slide here to show you which were the supporters in this particular case. A lot of money that came from the Netherlands, also from Switzerland, also from the USA, but also, importantly, increasingly locally from China. And I'm very, very grateful to all these benefactors, supporting institutions, and so on, that have kicked in. This is the list. And then it's very important for Global Flyway Network to reach out. We think it's important to share the stories. And right now we try to do this in two particular ways. One is entertaining a website, www.globalflywaynetwork.org, showing the different flowers of the world and actually giving you the maps with the latest news on the birds. So this is undigested news that you get fresh. So you can be part of the discovery. And this would be an effort that, of course, could be expanded in the future, but that also needs resources. Well, the second way is that we have this Twitter service at Global Flyway, in which we try to annotate what you can see on the website and also share all the news on the global problems that the birds are faced with and that we are faced with. So let me share you this this little movie in the end. I'll put the sound out. It's not very interesting. It's wind. This is one of the captures of Global Flyway Network of Chris in Roebuck Bay, and the children of Broome releasing the birds that are disappearing in the distance at sunset. The red cliff in the distance. You can't really see how warm it is here right now. And this is the release of the birds. And with this, I have shared some of the things that I would like to share from you. So thank you.